All right, we're going to talk about the relationship between moral philosophy and God. We're talking about a Western conception of God. We could spend a whole nother class talking about other conceptions of God or polytheistic interpretations of the divine, but we'll focus today on a Western monotheistic notion of God where God has at least the following character traits. God is all knowing, in other words, omniscient. God is all powerful, in other words, omnipotent. And God is wholly good or all good, omnibenevolent. So I used to assign an entire reading from an ancient Greek philosopher named Plato, a dialogue from Plato called the Euthyphro dilemma. But there's really just one essential question from that reading that we'll focus on. We'll get to that question in a second, but let me give you a little bit of background on Plato. He's one of the most influential philosophers of all time, at least from Western philosophy. And he was a student of Socrates. He was a mentor and teacher of Aristotle. Plato lived in ancient Greece before the Common Era, 428 to 347. Founded the Academy in Athens, Plato's Academy, and that was one of the first institutions of learning in the Western world. There's a famous quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who was an English philosopher from the 19th and 20th century, who claimed that all of philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. Just kidding, that's not an image of Plato. Here's an image of Plato. No, just kidding again. Here is an image of Plato from one of the Renaissance painters, Raphael, which you can go see in Rome. And here is a statue of what Plato might have looked like. So the question that we're going to examine is from a dialogue Plato wrote in dialogues called the Euthyphro. And in this text, there are characters that are debating with one another, and one of the characters Plato's names after his mentor and teacher Socrates, and the other he names Euthyphro. So the Euthyphro dialogue, and it's Euthyphro in a debate with Socrates. We're going to be looking at the role, if any, of God's connection to morality, since this is an ethics class, and is God necessary for morality? And so we covered those bullet points already. So here is the question, at least for me, in Plato's Euthyphro. The question is, are actions right because the gods command them, or do the gods command them because they're right? Now, at first glance, you might think that these are two different ways of saying the same thing. Actions are right because the gods command them. The gods command because they're right. That's two different ways of saying the same thing. But if you stop and think about it for a second, you'll realize that each clause in the question is really specifying a certain order of determination. So either the source of moral rightness is God's commands. In other words, if God commands something, then it's necessarily morally good. Or in other words again, whatever God's command, that defines what's good. So if God commands telling the truth, that's good. And if God were to have commanded lying, then that would be morally good. So in that sense, God determines morality. Or perhaps that's not the way things are. Instead, maybe God's commands are determined by what is morally good. In this sense, moral goodness or moral righteousness is independent from what God commands. And so in that sense, God's commands would be constrained by the good. In this way, goodness exists independently of God, and God in God's infinite wisdom recognizes the morally good and passes that information along to us in the form of commands. Moral rightness determines what God's commands are. In this way, God, we get to be careful with the word merely, but in a sense, God merely detects morality. God's like a messenger. He's tracking it and then passes that morality on to us. So this creates a dilemma for us, the Euthyphro dilemma. It seems like there's only two options. We can go with option A or option B. And it's a dilemma for Plato because either way we run into trouble, at least if we want to have some kind of tie between God and morality. So we have a dilemma with two horns. Either God determines morality or God detects morality and passes it along. What's the problem with the B horn? Well, if we go with B, then God is constrained by moral rightness, which is external to God. And if that's right, then morality is independent from God. Well, that's a problem if you think that God is necessary for morality. Now, millions of people in the world who are atheists don't want to say that, but there are probably billions of people living today that do believe and want to believe that God is necessary for morality, that there's a tie between God and morality, and it's one where God is required if there's going to be morality. But if we go with B, then God is sort of unnecessary, is sort of supplemental. You could have morality without God, but for many believers, including many Christians, that wouldn't be the case. So maybe we should go with A. So here again are A and B. Well, if we go with the A direction, the so-called A horn, then if God determines which actions are morally good, then God could have commanded anything, even wicked things like child abuse and slavery. If morality just is whatever God says, there would be nothing to stop God from commanding things that are what we believe to be wicked, like child abuse and slavery and lying and torture. And if we were to throw up our hands and our fists and bang them on the table and say, "How unjust of you, God, what an evil God," we really wouldn't be able to say that, because what evil and what wrong and right just mean are whatever God says. So God could say, "Hey, I make up the rules, and I'm saying that slavery is morally okay. And if we go with this definition, that would be the case." A lot of people's initial reaction to this A-horn problem is that no, God wouldn't command things like child abuse and slavery because God's not like that. Didn't we say God is wholly good? God wouldn't do that because God's commands are always good. And at first blush, that seems like a fair reply, but we are philosophers in training, and if we reflect on this reply, we will see that it's very problematic. Why is that? Well, the reply ends up being a circular one. Let's examine it more closely. God wouldn't command things like child abuse and slavery because God's commands are always good. So like I said, prima facie, or it's Latin for at first glance, more or less, this looks good. But the reply depends on appealing to what is good. God's commands are good. But think about what that means. What does good mean if we go with this A horn? If we go with this definition of good? Good is whatever God commands. So if we put in whatever God commands in for good, if we, as the second bullet point says, substitute the definition of the word good into the reply, it's no longer satisfactory because it's circular. Right? According to A, something called X is good, if and only if. Remember, that's what IFF stands for. X is in accordance with God's commands. So the reply would become, God wouldn't command things like child abuse and slavery because God's commands are always in accordance or always accord with God's commands. to put it a little more plainly, God wouldn't command child abuse because God commands what God commands. But that's not a satisfactory reply at all. So let's recap. The problem is, if we go with the A horn of dilemma, there's nothing to stop God from commanding wicked things. God could command child abuse. And then you might think, no, God wouldn't do that because God only commands good things. Well, think about what you're saying when you say God only commands good things. You're saying God commands things that God would command. Right? And that alone isn't going to stop God from commanding child abuse. Right? God commands child abuse. And isn't it true that God is commanding what God commands? Yes. So saying that God commands what God commands, God do what he do, or God does what God does, in other words, that's not going to be enough to prevent God from commanding wicked things. What's going on here is the reply contains a circular explanation. Circular explanations don't work in general because they don't give us an explanation. Really. They are uninteresting, unhelpful, they're repetitive. Maybe they're true. Yeah, God does command what God commands, but in a very trivial way. It's like when your parents used to tell you, you can't stay out past midnight because I told you so. They're not really giving you an explanation for why you can't stay out midnight. They're kind of just repeating themselves. Look, I'm telling you can't stay out past midnight. Why? Because I'm telling you. You know, really, there's some other justification, like, I know what's good for you. But that's really different than just saying, I'm telling you that you can't stay past midnight. There's more content in the, I know what's better for you. Or suppose I gave $1 million or $1 billion to someone that could explain how to prevent climate change. And then someone, I say, first person who can come up with the explanation gets $1 billion, and you come to contact me and you're all excited and you say, look, the way that we can stop climate change is if we stop climate change. Well, of course, that's true, right? But it doesn't really have any interesting content in it. It's just circular. So going back a little bit, there's one other way to think about these two different positions. One where God determines morality, and another where God is independent from morality, or morality is independent from God, and God is just kind of detecting properties of the world that are out there and external. Think about maps for a second. If you go to Google Maps or Apple Maps, or you go to the map app on your phone, or you go to a map app on your desktop or laptop, computer, or your tablet. There's so many devices now, isn't that funny? It's like, did I cover them all? Okay, I got the phone, got the tablet, laptop, desktop. Now, pretty soon your graphing calculators will have map functions on them. In any case, on that map app, you can look at the Earth in map view, as it's sometimes described, or from the Earth view. And so when you put Earth view, the lines of the countries go away, usually, and you can see where the mountains are and where the oceans are and where the natural coastlines are, and you can see parts that are green and parts that are dry. And then if you go to the map view, all that goes away, and you're not really seeing mountains and the depth or the elevation of the geography, and you're seeing roads, and you're seeing state lines and political lines and all the countries, and the names of all the cities, right? So think about those two views, the Earth view and the map view of your map app on your phone or on your computer. Well, think about the shape of, say, one of the Great Lakes, say Lake Michigan, versus the shape of a state like Colorado. Who determined those shapes? Who determined the shape of Lake Michigan? Did human beings determine that shape? Think of the shape of the lake, especially thousands of years ago. Now maybe there's constructions and dammings and we can kind of affect the shape. But think of the shape of Lake Michigan, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. What determined that shape? It wasn't human beings. It was just kind of nature, right? It's just the way the world is. And think about the shape of Michigan. Did nature determine the shape? The shape of the state of Colorado. You could do Michigan too, but Colorado's nice because it's pretty square. What determined the shape of Colorado? Did nature, those lines you see that make Colorado kind of that rectangle square shape that it is? Are there, like lines in the sand that make up that shape? No, right? It was human beings. Those lines are sort of invisible. They're political. They're determined by human beings. And sometimes they follow lakes or they follow natural land divisions, but they don't have to. And which lakes and which land divisions, that is determined by human beings, right? So that's one way to think about this A view, this A horn, and this B horn. So which goes with which? Well, with the A view, the mind of a being, in this case God, is determining morality. Just like in the map view, it's human beings that determine the shape of the states, like Colorado. And in B, the human mind has no causal impact, has no, is not determining, the mind or the beliefs are not determining what the shape of the lake is, either because it predates those minds or because it's just independent of their decision making. So B, in a sense, where God is detecting morality, is like a human being detecting or tracking the shape of Lake Michigan, right? Human beings are not causing that shape, they just are mapping it, they just are figuring it out. And so the shape is independent from their decision making, right? The shape of Lake Michigan, especially thousands of years ago, is or was independent of human beings' judgments or decision making. And in the B horn, what is morally good is independent of God's decision making and God's commands. But on A, morality is dependent on God's command. God determines morality, like it says, just like it's human decision making that determines the shape of the state of Colorado, for example. Right? So the problem, again, with A is that since it's really up to God, God can make the state of Colorado, just like humans could have made the shape of Colorado any way they want. God can make the morality anything that God wants, including what would seem strange to us, morally wicked actions like neglecting children or lying. Now you might say, well, let's go with B then, because then we get around this arbitrariness problem where God is allowed to command wicked things. But if that's right, then God is like on the sidelines just detecting, just like humans are at the sidelines when it comes to the shape of Lake Michigan. Human decision making has nothing to do with the shape of Lake Michigan, especially millions of years ago. And if we go with B, then God's decision making has nothing to do with what will come out as morally good or morally right or wrong. And the problem there is that God is like an afterthought. God is superfluous. God is unnecessary for morality. There's not that strong tie. God is not required for morality. And while that might sit well with a lot of atheists, that's not going to sit well with many believers in God. There's probably billions of people that believe that. Okay, now we can go back to where we were. There's an interesting video that's pretty well produced that argues that God exists and that the existence of morality actually proves the existence of God. So either do a web search on YouTube or on Google for the moral argument, or follow that link. Links change a lot, so hopefully it works. If it doesn't, hopefully the web search will. You can always email me and I can send it to you. But the view is without God, there would be no morality. So there are a couple points that I want you to be aware of in this video. So one is, without God, there would be no morality, and there's an argument that God exists because we have morality. And then the speaker in the video also makes a claim about the Euthyphro dilemma. So the speaker of the video asks, well, is it the A horn or the B horn? Is God on the sidelines or is God running the show? And then the speaker says neither. So this is a common reaction to the Euthyphro dilemma from many theists, from many believers in God. They will claim that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma, that there are more options than just the A or B position. There's a third option, perhaps a C option, that is God wills something, in this case, what is good, because God is good. And it seems like what we've talked about would apply to that position, that even if that is distinct from the A horn or the B horn, it's not obviously clear that that's the case. First of all, that it's distinct, but even if it is, it seems like it falls victim to that circularity problem. Is that God willing something because God is good is not going to prevent God from willing to, say, child neglect. And you say, well, God wouldn't do that because God is good. But remember, we've defined what good means. Good just means it's what's in accord with God's commands. So you're just saying God will good things because God wills what God wills. Okay, just because somebody wills what they are going to will or command what they're going to command doesn't mean it's going to be good in the intuitive sense, right? I mean, Hitler commanded what Hitler commanded, but that didn't mean that it was good. Just because you command what you command doesn't mean it's going to be what we consider to be intuitively good. So, it's an interesting, something to take seriously and an interesting reaction to the classic Euthyphro dilemma, but it might be the case that it falls short. Okay, so that's one of the interesting components of the video. It also contains this moral argument that I talked about a little bit in the first bullet point. Without God, there would be no morality. Or more specifically, the argument looks like this. This is a shot from the video. The conclusion is God exists. Why? Well, because if there's no God, then there wouldn't be objective moral goodness or moral values. They wouldn't exist. But there are objective moral values and duties. They do exist. So God exists. So this argument, the logic of it works. So now if we want to continue to evaluate it, we'd have to look to see if the premises, the first two parts, are right, if they're true. So the video does provide evidence for the second premise, that objective morality and values do exist, and it's kind of based on moral intuition and our moral experience. That it just seems like there are some things that there are some actions, for example, like what we talked about before, child neglect or lying for fun or torture, slavery, that are objectively wrong or universally wrong. And that's because when we consider the alternative, it seems to not make sense. Um, if some culture, some person were to claim that, as the video says, raping children, it's hard for me to even say that, it's so bad. If someone were to believe that, they would just be wrong, right? So, valuing children and protecting them seems to be just as true as, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. And so if you believe otherwise, it's like believing 2 plus 2 equals 5. But the speaker in the video, the tallest order is to defend 1. So if there's a world without God, does that mean that there wouldn't be objective morality? So someone like Plato would argue that this first premise is false, that there could be objective morality even if there is no God. And the basis of this objective morality would just be objective features of the world. So they just like 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's that is the case, and you could imagine that imagine a world without God. Could 2 plus 2 still equal 4? Well, sure. It's not conceptually obvious why that would be impossible. And so similarly, what would ground objective moral values? Well, it could be just the way the world is. It could be objective features of the world, just like what grounds the laws of nature, right? That's just kind of how the world evolved, right? Historically. That would be one way. Or there's different kinds of objectivity, and this goes a little bit behind kind of the introductory thinking of the video. So you could have a sense of objective that's a little bit weaker than the strongest sense of objective. So the strongest sense of objective would be completely independent of the decisions or the thinking or the language or the minds of any particular person or being. Like this, like I said, like the shape of Lake Michigan millions of years ago. The rules about that, or the way that lake, the shape of that lake, has nothing to do with human decision making. So that is objective, and that's objective in a very, very strong sense. However, you could have objective in a little bit of a weaker sense, that the truth maker, as it were, for like a moral rule, like don't lie, might not be features of the world independent of human decision making. It could be based on human decision making that are either agreed upon by a large number of people. Like you could go as far, you could start with a small village. You could talk about the agreement of a nation or a culture. You could talk about the agreement of people, all the people currently living. You kind of like a United Nations thing. You could talk about what psychologically humans tend to believe. Human beings tend to react negatively to pain, especially pain of innocence, and to lying and to neglecting of children. You could even talk about a moral code that's based on the decisions of sort of an ideal panel of human beings. So if maybe a future unbiased group of human beings, and this gets into the kind of thinking that we covered with John Rawls in his rational agents in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. So what these ideal agents, the decisions that they would make about right and wrong, that could be the basis of moral values. And to a degree, there's objectivity there, at least more objective than just being based on one single random culture, human culture in the history of the world, and certainly more objective than just what any individual says. So interesting argument here. Maybe it's true. We have some evidence for the second premise. The logic of the argument works, but it really hinges on that first premise, if that's true. and you'll get some pushback from a lot of philosophers. So that's something for you to think about and to put in your discussion boards, is whether or not you think that first if-then statement is the case. Someone like Plato and somebody like Rawls might disagree. So one of the readings from our course that's up next is from a philosopher named Kyle Nielsen, and he writes about ethics without God. So he argues that even as God is dead, as Friedrich Nietzsche, famous German existential philosopher, famously asserted, that morality is still possible, and it's going to be based on natural human drives and inclinations. So even if there is no God, still humans want to be free from pain. We want to enjoy simple pleasures, enjoy security and emotional peace, enjoy human love and companionship, have creative and meaningful work, and enjoy a variety of experiences. And their drives and value, and there is an enjoyment from helping and the suffering of others. So these all occur kind of naturally in our species, at least for Nielsen, and that these pursuits and drives could serve as the framework for human morality. So even if there's no God, we still will want these A through G things, and that's going to keep human beings with these drives, and the rules that we come up with are going to stem from them. And so ethics without God is possible, at least for Nielsen. Again, he argues that even if God doesn't exist, these drives will lend to moral behavior. The claim Nielsen addresses something like, if God doesn't exist, we'd all be selfish, evil savages. There'd be constant chaos and war. So that's kind of goes along with the view from the speaker in the video, the moral argument. From that kind of perspective, if there wasn't a God, there'd be no morality, at least not objective morality, and we'd all be selfish and evil and savages. There'd be constant chaos and war. But even if there's no God, chaos wouldn't ensue because of our drives for A through G. So when you think about human morality without society, and that's depicted in literature and television and film and theater, in TV shows that a lot of you guys might like, Walking Dead shows up in literature, like Lord of the Flies, any post-apocalyptic or scenario or storyline where human beings are isolated away from society and civilization goes away, that's kind of when our true colors would come out, and that's like a world without God. And what the show's explore is, would morality still exist? Well, maybe at first there'd be chaos and there would be war, but eventually our drives through A through G would lead us to get back on that moral track, I think, is what the authors of a lot of those pieces of literature and storytelling, that's the point that they might agree with. So this is a form of what's called ethical naturalism, that you can get objective morality from the natural world. You don't have to appeal to the supernatural. And maybe even it's consistent with Aristotle or the utilitarians. It says which we're covering next, so that is not true. We already covered that. So I've done different versions of this class, or we went in different order. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of that, and I will see you, as it were, next time.